theology in his undergrad, and so this has been a topic of interest of his. And so maybe you have seen him on some different programs. Some of you are nodding your heads on television or radio. And so we're here to learn tonight and connect. He has some things he's sharing this weekend. We do have some things available for those that pre-registered at the table, and there will be some drawings of interest in our last meeting tomorrow. If you got this sheet right here at the beginning, the big blue ocean-looking sheet right there, that has many topics of interest. So we're going to be information-rich this weekend. But we know that you have invitations to many places. We appreciate taking time with us. We're privileged to have you in Spirit Lake. If you bow your heads, let's open with a word of prayer this evening. Heavenly Father, thank you that we can be together this evening and that we can learn from your word and from your book of nature. Bless our time together, anchor our faith in your ability to create and our confidence in your ability to recreate our hearts. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Hello. Everybody good? Everybody happy? Okay, that's great. It's nice. I thought it was nice weather. Is this nice weather for you? Okay, that's great. Good. I'm glad. I was in Anchorage about 3 weeks ago, and when I went to a school there for a program, 16 below zero. There's cold, and then there's below zero. That's way different. So anyway, and I started to think, boy, Panhandle of Idaho, do they have snow up there now? Thank you for not having snow right now. I want to appreciate that. But anyway, we had a good time. Yeah, my name is Stan Hudson, and I've been on an interesting journey with God. Years ago, I was studying geology and wanted to be a science, and I was at UC Riverside. And as back in the day, as my son would put it, Dad, you live back in the day. I don't think it's a compliment. But anyway, I remember I had a very weak Christian background. Very weak. My mom and dad divorced. My mom felt a need to raise her 2 children, my sister and I, with a little extra help, and so put me into Adventist schools. And even though I did not become a Christian during those years, it did give me an option later on in life as I started to consider where my life was going. And when I went to UC Riverside, my major professor announced to the class one day that we're going to have a creationist speaker come to campus tonight. And then he kind of chuckled about it. And then he acted like embarrassed. He shouldn't have chuckled. That wasn't nice to chuckle. And so, as he started to gather his thoughts, he said, well, I believe in God. And the rest of the class period was, what do you mean? And as I was watching him trying to unravel his thoughts, he clearly was struggling with where he was going to put God in the picture. Where am I putting God in the origin picture? And it began to strike me as, boy, it's not very logical what he's thinking here. So finally I asked the question, I got brave enough and asked my question. I said, Professor, are you saying then that nature was sufficient to create and organize itself, and then a being across the universe looked at this planet and said, that planet's going to need a God. I'm going to go offer my services. So if God had nothing to do with us being here, who is he? Like a big space alien or something? What was he? And it didn't strike me as, and I felt bad as soon as I asked the question because, I thought I'm embarrassing him and he's struggling with that question. Sorry about that. You don't do that to your professor. But anyway, it eventually ended up with me thinking where my life was going. And eventually, with the help of a good friend, ended up selecting God's work. But I never lost my interest. I never lost my interest in neuroscience because it's fascinating to me. And I'm going to share with you a program that we've developed that really deals with these things. We're going to look at 4 parts of the 6-part series. The first part is the one that starts it, and that is the origin of debate. why science tends to think one thing and why religion tends to think another, and why there is this conflict and how did that happen. So here we go as we take a look at the origin of the debate itself. And no, that's not a picture of me in the lower left, okay? Or at the top, for that matter. Okay, so let's take a look. Why is it that science and religion seem to be in struggles with each other? I used to pastor a church in Moscow, Idaho, and at the university there, University of Idaho, there was lots of these kind of stickers, these Darwin stickers on bumpers all around. And so when you see that, you know what they're saying. It's a play off of the Christian fish symbol, and it's a little bit like a combat sort of, kind of back at you Christians. I don't believe in that Jesus stuff. I believe in Darwin and evolution. So we had that kind of thinking going on around us. The Gallup poll that's been taken, and they've been taking them every 3 or 4 years, of what Americans think about where we came from. There are 3 basic options: recent creation, theistic evolution, and natural evolution. And these are the numbers that came out in this most recent poll. Now, you will see that 38 and 38%, 76% of Americans believe God had something to do with us getting here. Now, the 19% is actually up a few degrees over a century or so of poll taking, mostly among young people, because young people have tended to think more highly of the idea that religion is bad because look at the wars in the world, religion-based, so let's just get rid of the whole thing. So there's a lot of atheism and agnosticism in young people. But of those 3, which only can be taught in public schools? The least popular view. So are we going to have fights over this? Yeah, you probably heard some. But there you go. You can see that we're going to have some problems. What is theistic evolution? Theistic, anything with theos is God. Theistic evolution is the belief that Darwin was right. Evolution did happen, but God's doing it. God's using evolution to create new species and us today. So it's sort of a how does somebody even think that? Well, it's because they have a high view of science, they have a high view of religion, and they're just trying to somehow meld those two together. It doesn't work very well, but nevertheless, a lot of people try to make it work. So, theistic evolution, and we'll talk a little more about these things as we get into it. So what is science? It comes from the Latin word scientia, which is knowledge. And it's acquiring knowledge based on scientific method. Now I want you to see a difference between science as we define it here, because there's a difference between hard science, which is laboratory, testable things that you can repeat, and frankly was a traditional view of what science was. But then there is also philosophical science or historical science, where they take things they believe are testable, but then they expand and go off into various areas of theory that cannot be tested, and so are not technically science in that hard sense. That's very important to remember. Historical science is not testable, and it will always be subject, that last line is critical, because we're going to talk about worldviews, and everything depends upon worldviews. It is absolutely the center. And you'll see why. Always subject to favored models and worldviews. For instance, how do worldviews enter into it? Let's talk about history. Let's say there's historians writing about the Pilgrims. And one historian takes a look at the Pilgrim story and says, I think that the reason that they moved to America, they were seeking land to take away from the Native Americans that lived here. Or you could have a historian say, they were seeking religious freedom and trying to find a place where they could worship God the way they felt. Now, the way those historians express it are going to tell you more about the historians than the Pilgrims. Do you understand that? They will be sharing things as they interpret it through their worldview. Everybody's got a worldview. You and I have it. And what I want you to understand especially is worldview affects how we interpret data. It's all about this. Data is the same. I mean, let's face it, if facts are facts, why don't we all agree? Can I mention COVID? Okay, no, let's not talk that. But look, Look at how much difference there is when everybody thinks there's a certain body of facts, but everybody is looking at it from different ways, and it is absolutely the same in origins when we're talking about science and these subjects. So data is not the same thing as interpretation. Has to do with your worldview. For instance, these are 5 questions that affect your worldview. What's your supreme authority? Where do you go for a final word on something? Where did everything come from? What is your place in this world? What is your moral code? Why do you think some things are right or wrong? And what is your future? However you answer those things are absolutely going to affect your worldview. It was a minister who first studied and promoted fossils in Oregon. I do a lot of work in Oregon. He became Oregon's first state paleontologist, a minister back in the 1800s, Thomas Condon. And this is what he wrote, as he was a believer in evolution and God. The hills from which these evidences were taken, he wrote in reference to the evolutionary record of the fossil beds, quote, were made by the same God who made the hills of Judea, and the evidences are as authoritative. The church has nothing to fear from the uncovering of the truth. He also said evolution was simply God's method of working and therefore not atheistic or infidel. Okay, so you can see where he's going. Now here's my question for you. Based on what he said, what is his supreme authority? In other words, what does he believe above all else? If there's a mix, which one he says, I believe this one above any others? Was it the Bible or was it science? So it was science, right? That was his supreme authority that counteracted the place of the Bible in understanding it. And that, everybody has a worldview. That was his supreme authority. So your worldview will affect how you look at everything. People, war, science, faith. It will affect how you look at the planet and the origin of the planet, of course, chicken and the egg there, and where you think the world is going to go, and most definitely will affect your view of God. Your worldview affects your view of God and where he fits in the picture. Now, in 1998, this is a poll of National Academy of Science leaders. These are the people who put together the curriculum of what will be taught on origins in public schools and even in universities. And what is their personal belief, i.e. worldview? How many believe in a personal God? 7%. How many disbelieve, as in quite sure there is no personal God? 72%. Agnostic or doubt, 21%. So you can see that the majority of scientists that are affecting what we are taught in schools have a personal belief that is strongly oriented against religion or at least Christianity. And so how can their beliefs not come out? Of course they're going to come out. All our beliefs come out. Our worldviews are not hard to figure out. Even though Sir Isaac Newton said no sciences are better attested than the religion of the Bible. He was a great scientist. Many people think he had an IQ over 200. That's a very high stratosphere. So what happened? Where did things change? Since the 1200s, universities in Europe, like Cambridge here, only taught that God had created the world like the Bible said. And for centuries, all their graduates tended to believe what their professors taught. Now, however, today's universities in the West only teach that nature, or material, created and organized everything we see, and now most all graduates tend to think the same as their professors. You know, that happens. But what was really interesting is something that this guy wrote. Now, this guy was a Harvard-trained physicist, and he was PhD at Harvard, and he surprised the science world by saying, you know what, we think we're so objective. I actually think we work from models, and it's really hard to change a model. He started off by thinking, I wonder what Aristotle thought about the universe. And it was really interesting to him. He made it a personal quest to somehow get inside his brain. How did Aristotle think about everything? And he got there. He thought he got there finally. He said, well, why don't we think that anymore? How did the model change from that to what we have today? And he reviewed the history of science, and he said, it is hard to change a model. Once a model is ingrained, scientists, like other people, tend to favor their personal opinions and do not have this objective view that, you know, they like to promote. The thing that surprised me when I was a UC Riverside student was science didn't want to talk about the problems in evolution. I didn't see any openness, any willingness to talk about what I thought were several things that were a problem. And that bothered me because I had always thought, I think from Hollywood, I'm not sure where I got the image, that science was the only place that you could go and objectively talk about something. In other words, if you go to a group of scientists and say, I know this is the current thinking, but you know what, I have a theory that would be different than that. Do you want to hear it? And I would think they would say, if it's better, let's go. We're ready to throw out our old theory and let's hear this one. Come to find out, they're just like all the rest of us. Just as biased and just as protective of our theories and our views as anybody else. They're just normal. Now, the problem with that is they project themselves as something different, that they're objective. And I don't think so. And that's what this guy found out and wrote a book about it. And actually, he stirred up the science world to where they now actually kind of agree with him a little bit. And have you ever heard of the concept of paradigm and paradigm shift? This is the guy who came up with that. So he said it's hard to get a paradigm shift in a model. Let me give you an example from history. Have you ever heard of alchemy? Back in the Middle Ages, every self-respecting king had a full-time alchemist on his staff. And he was given the job of please make lead into gold. Now they're both heavy, they're both soft. It looks like it should be simple. Lead is bad, gold is good. Make gold. And so for hundreds of years, they operated under that model, trying to make lead into gold. And they never had a single example of it working. And yet they operated under that model. The point is, they had reasons to hope the model was true. They stuck with it, and it took an awful lot to change that model, like Kuhn said. Now, you probably think that that is a light bulb. Actually, it's not. It's a dark sucker. It sucks dark out of a room. Where's your faith? Come on. Take a look. When you throw the switch, electricity runs through it, and it sucks the dark out of the room. Haven't you seen it do that? And take a look. When it fills up, and it has no more room to put more dark in it, it doesn't work anymore. Okay? So there is an alternate model to try to explain how things are. And you can see maybe it makes some sense. Anyway, it's funny how some models seem to carry the weight for a while. Now here, remember I told you the objectivity thing was a question I had. We have a prior commitment, says Richard Lewitton, a biologist at Harvard, a commitment to materialism. And when he says materialism, he's not talking about Mercedes-Benzes. He's talking about material in the universe. In other words, it says it's absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. What he's saying is material is all there is. Material begets material. There's nothing unseen. There's no other supernatural, beyond nature thing. And we have a commitment to interpret everything this way. Is that a worldview? That's a worldview. This is how we're going to filter everything to where we always come up with a picture that doesn't have a divine foot in the door. And interestingly, science already admits, and you see this regularly, I could give you lots of quotes from scientists that are evolutionists. They say, biology is the study of complicated things that have the appearance, give the appearance of design. They agree. Design looks like it's there. And yet they can say without losing a beat, isn't evolution wonderful to produce accidentally these designs? Okay, what are you doing? You're making your model work no matter what, right? Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. This is a guy that co-founded DNA. So, brilliant man in terms of science. But anyway, he's trying to tell him, oh, this looks designed. Nope, not designed. Can't be designed. So the human mind can tell when something is randomly made. Now you can tell these mountains were formed by erosion, by water, by rain, by winds. But it gets a little harder when you see something like that. So you see organization, and the human mind can immediately pick up the difference between random acts and design. We got it, we can see this. But the biggest and most fundamental science question of all will always reveal a worldview. What's the biggest question? Come on, let's see if you can guess it. What's the biggest question in science? Well, more specifically, come on now, you're all chicken, and incidentally, that's okay. Pardon me? Well, yeah, but even beyond that. How did life appear? And to science, that's the big question. How did life appear? In a way, it's how did we get here, but it's how life appeared. How, and we're talking about inorganic, something of chemicals that somehow became organized and made into life. So, definition, a principle or force that is considered to underlie the distinctive quality of animate beings, characterized by a capacity for metabolism, growth, reaction to stimuli, and reproduction. How do you like that? Does that warm your heart as a description of life? Okay, and then they just basically give up. They say there's currently now no consensus regarding the definition of life. They don't know what it is. They know it when they see it, but they don't know what it is. And what's interesting is there could be as many as 4 different kinds of life that somehow came up. Plant, animal, fungus, bacteria. All these are so distinctively different, it's hard to imagine a single source from them. So how did life arise from inorganic material? And that's really the great unknown. So did life come from outer space? Believe it or not, there is a significant number of scientists who like to go that way. Now, anywhere from life appeared accidentally. And why did they do that at all? Because they don't feel there's been long enough time on Earth. So you got to kick the can down the road and find an earlier time, an older place that maybe life came from. And so, how did it get here? It was either from a broken piece of that planet that somehow blew up and went through the universe and landed here and seeded life, or, and you can think of the problems of that through the vacuum of space, or some little green men in a flying saucer. And I'm not kidding. There are people who believe that. So, what's interesting is there is no known circumstance in which it can be confirmed that microscopic beings came into the world without germs, without parents similar to themselves. Who wrote that? Louis Pasteur. And that became a law, that life only comes from living things. So this proved the popular theory of spontaneous generation, which is biogenesis. In other words, the beginning of life from somewhere else. But so now, basically, they think in abiogenesis, or in other words, life came from something that wasn't alive, via natural chemical processes from a hot chemical vent or pool, and it goes right against a law in science, So laws don't have the status you might think in science. So anyway, it would have to come because of chemistry and not biology. Have you ever heard of this old experiment? For a while it was in National Geographic, I remember it. One of the reasons I remember it because Miller's first name is Stanley, and that's kind of rare. So I remembered this. This is where he had tried to put together the atmosphere of a pre-life world, and lightning and methane and all the different components, and try to put it all together, proper heat source and everything, and somehow or other try to get some amino acids made. And guess what? He made a couple of amino acids out of it. They weren't ones that we could find particularly useful or not, but anyway, they were amino acids. Amino acids become proteins, proteins become building blocks, and so on. So he thought, for a while, this was shown to be like, look at this. Maybe life could come from just natural chemical processes. But the more they studied this thing, the more they realized, yeah, but the early Earth, as we figure out, didn't have any of this going on, and temperature's wrong, and lots of different things were wrong, and now they agree that this didn't happen. If you think so, take a look. But how did the basic chemicals present on early Earth spontaneously arrange themselves into something resembling life? How did we get DNA? What did the first cells look like? More than half a century after the chemist Stanley Miller proposed his primordial soup, have you ever heard of primordial soup? There it is. Theory, we still can't agree about what happened. So, anyway, Incidentally, when they saw bubbles, they thought, oh, that's the beginning of cells. That's where cells come from. When Robert Hooke looked through an early microscope at the body, the skin, he saw what looked like monastery rooms, and he called them cells. So that stuck. And by Darwin's time, it was thought that these cells had protoplasm, which is a jelly. I can kind of see where they'd come up with an image of, we're made of jelly. Yeah, there seems some logic there. But the more they have studied the human cell, it's just ridiculous. So complicated. Now it's a turn of the fundamental science of life, modern biochemistry, to disturb. Their turn to be disturbed. The simplicity that was once expected to be the foundation of life is proven to be a phantom. Instead, systems of horrendous, irreducible complexity inhabit the cell. So the cell is no longer a room with jelly in it. It is complex beyond comprehension. In fact, there are 40 trillion cells in our bodies with 200 different types and functions. And some of them have little motors that are operating in them, and the complexity is off the scale. If there is a consistent pattern that I see in science where there is a pothole, shall we say, that they never miss while they're driving down the road, they can't seem to avoid it, and that is that they assume things are simpler than they turn out to be. Do you remember when Pluto had that probe go by Pluto, the planet Pluto is now considered a planetoid or whatever. But when that probe went by Pluto and they broadcast the pictures back to the scientists at Earth and NASA, and I was watching this live picture as they were just coming in, and the scientists were all huddled around these TV screens, are all excited to take these first close-ups of Pluto. And can I paraphrase the way they looked as they came? It was something like this. Oh, oh yeah. Huh? Almost everything they expected to see, they didn't. And what did they see? A far more complex planet than they expected. Again, it's this idea of assuming everything is simpler than it turns out to be. When you think about the planets of our solar system, they supposedly all came about by gravity condensing these balls of matter into planets. But to me, the platter was the same stuff. And yet, if you look at all of the planets and all of the moons around the planets, every single one of them is distinctly different from the other. I mean, there's variety, like crazy variety in the solar system, and how they could all coalesce from the same platter of matter is interesting to me. The point is there's complexity everywhere, wherever we look. Now, the perfect storm for evolution to arise in the 19th century is very easy to explain. First of all, the weakening of the Bible standing. We had the Age of Reason going on, and the Bible was begun to be made fun of, or at least not taken seriously. Higher criticism was coming along. They doubted the Mosaic origins of early books and so on. So the Bible was being weakened. And incidentally, Charles Darwin was taught by people who believed in a weaker Bible. The discovery of key fossils like Archaeopteryx, which is that looks like a half bird, half lizard kind of fossil. Dinosaurs are being found, and they hadn't talked about dinosaurs before. We'll talk about dinosaurs tomorrow. Neanderthal was being found, bones of a man in Germany, in a valley there, in a cave. And he was stooped over. And they found out later he was stooped over because he had rickets. But the first one they found was he was bent over. And so it struck people like, this is a cave. I mean, he lived in a cave. There's the origin of cavemen. And cavemen started to make it seem like this Darwin guy must have something going, because it looks like there's things that his theory would seem to make sense about. There was ignorance about the complexity of genetics, like protoplasm, instead of what we really see. And the growing belief that the world was perhaps millions of years old. And you need millions of years old for evolution to work. You need time for it to work, time and chance. Who is this guy? And no, this is not me. This is Charles Darwin. You know his story. sailed on the HMS Beagle to the Galapagos Islands, and he published Origin of Species in 1859. World-changing book, as it turned out. Sold out immediately, 1,000 copies. I've seen one reverently displayed in a museum in Chicago with a light on it, as though it were a King James first edition, you know, that kind of reverence. And it is interesting, worth a lot of money. What did Charles Darwin see, and how did he change things? He did not come up with a theory of evolution that was already more or less being accepted. What did he do? He gave a model of what made sense of evolution, how it supposedly might happen. So he went to the Galapagos Islands as a scientist on board the HMS Beagle, which was a map-making tour for the British government. They came into Galapagos Islands and wanted to buy some food at the local Safeway. So they went there to the meat department and said, "What you got?" And said, "Well, we've got tortoises." Tortoises, okay. Okay, we'll take some tortoises. And but notice that when they were talking about the tortoises, that the natives said, "This tortoise came from that island over there, but these over here, they came from that island over there." Well, how can you tell that? Oh, the shape of the shells are different. Shape of the shells from what island they're from. Oh, began to think maybe they had a common ancestor, and somehow or other, over time, they changed the shape of the shell a little bit, depending upon where they were. Incidentally, we all agree that's probably true. Still tortoises. Same with the finches. You've heard of the finches, Galapagos Island finches. These are some of the pictures. He collected some and took them back to England to some friends of his that were bird experts, and he said, "What are these?" These are all finches. They're all finches. Look at the bills. No, they're all finches. Well, the big bills, useful for eating very hard nuts, and the other bills were in different islands and different places with different food. So surely they had a common ancestor and somehow changed over time into these different kinds of finches. Incidentally, Pastor, can I have a drink of water? You got a cup of anything? That'd be good. I'm drying out, excuse me. So he again thought maybe these finches had a common ancestor. And actually, I agree. They probably did have a common ancestor. And the way that animals are designed, they do have some abilities to adapt, but they never change from birds to something else. We could talk about that. Believe me, we could. So what Darwin saw was survival of the fittest. That's his terminology, and that's what caught on. He said basically this: the natural process by which organisms best adjusted to their environment are most successful in surviving, and here's the key, folks, making babies. That's the winner. The winners make babies. So that's what keeps it going. So the strongest tend to do that more, and incidentally, we totally agree with that. But he thought that would produce net evolution, or change over time, a larger scale, permanent change that results in the formation of higher taxonomic means, the classification of groups, bigger, different. Now, this is the title of his book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races. So natural selection is survival of the fittest. What's natural selection? This. He lived in England. He was from England. And in England, they bred animals. They would bred horses, chickens, cattle, dogs, all of these different kinds of animals. And it would be done by selecting parents that we wanted to develop. Thank you. Thank you very much. Excuse me. Oh, yes. Thank you. So what was being done in England to select those parents was unnatural selection or man-made selection. Does nature have a way of selecting parents? See? And nature does, in the sense of it promotes, when there's so many resources and animals have got to fight for those resources, the ones that are most able to do it, the strongest, will survive and reproduce. So his way of coming up with natural selection won the day, seemed to save the day, because it made sense to people that over time nature might make some changes. Again, he assumed that it would continue to make changes until there were big changes. So he contributed a theory that explained. However, since survival of the fittest does not change the genetic code of living things, all it does is make a species fit. In other words, if you got tigers eating things and the strongest tigers survive, at the end of the day, what are you going to have? Really strong tigers. But you're not going to have anything different. You've got to somehow change the genetic code some way. So a new theory has emerged, and that is mutations. Oopses, mistakes in the copying of DNA from a parent to a child. In other words, you, according to evolution and science, are all walking mutants. I thought I'd get a little reaction out of that. You know, you are mutants. You are animated pond scum. You know, you are a series of fortunate accidents, mistakes, every one of them. So understand what the mistakes are. Mistakes are broken codes between parents and child in which over time, somehow or other, has accumulated into a far more complex creature. And not just humans, but every other planet, and animal on the planet, every other plant, and so forth. So this is called Neo-Darwinism, and Neo-Darwinism is still the most popular theory in science about how evolution works, even though it's under attack, and here's another however. There are even more problems with this theory. And Dennis Noble, who is an evolutionist and not a creationist by any stretch, a professor at Oxford University in England, talking about Neo-Darwinism, he said, all the central assumptions of the modern synthesis, that's Neo-Darwinism, mutations, have been what? Not only not proved, disproved. And what is he saying? He's saying that if there's anything in mutations we can test, all the things we've tested shows that it doesn't work. That mutations don't make better things. Mutations are always a loss of function. Something's broken, and that's what mutations are. And broken doesn't make something way better. Does that make sense? So he's admitting this. And he's saying to his fellow physiologists, scientists, we got to come up with a better theory because it's not working. Now, where do you hear this stuff in National Geographic or Nova or PBS or you know, any of these science programs? Where do you hear that they talk about the problems? They just assume that it still works, but they talk about the problems behind closed doors. The technical literature in biology is now replete with world-class biologists routinely expressing doubts about various aspects of neo-Darwinian theory. Rarely has there been such a great disparity between the popular perception of a theory and its actual standing in the relevant peer-reviewed science literature. Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying, I can't think of too many places where scientists are talking about the problems, but the public has no idea of them. You see that? So, interesting. Now, I'm going to show you a video that we made to go with this seminar. This is the seminar we've worked on that other churches, pastors and everything can put on. Your pastor talked to me very gently about, you know, coming over here and doing this while I was in the area. And so I was happy to do that. But I'm also kind of showing you what the seminar can do. This short video here will feature some good friends of mine and scientists, geoscience in Loma Linda University. And I want you especially to listen to Tim Standish, who Pastor Joe knows, at the beginning of this. And the third one, and Jim Gibson's a good friend, but after him is Ronnie Nalen, and after him is Susie Phillips. And listen to Susie Phillips, the biologist. She's great. So see what you think. And, you know, someone had to go to Hawaii and film this. I took for the team, you know. Okay, there's no sound just yet. Bereshit bara Elohim hashamayim v'haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And pretty much for centuries, through the Middle Ages, that was the single thought that people had about where origins came from. But then toward the 1800s, the age of reason that it is called now by science, the thought that maybe there was not an active God out there, and maybe the laws of nature was all that was in operation. So this skepticism grew about the biblical account. Charles Darwin was taught in a university, Cambridge University, that had this skepticism. And pretty soon, the worldview about where we came from dramatically changed. Today, we still have this debate going between creationists and evolutionists. And let's now take a look at the origin of this great debate.
To understand this, we need to go back to where science came from. It was a revolutionary new way of understanding our world. And what it did was it said, we're not going to bring all of our preconceptions into this. We're not going to let philosophers like Aristotle or somebody else tell us how the world works. What we're going to do is we're going to actually look at the world. We're going to use our empirical senses. That's our eyes, ears, sense of touch, those sorts of things. And those data that we collect using those senses, we will interpret in a logical way. And that was a very powerful tool then for figuring out what's going on in the world. But then some people added an additional rule called methodological naturalism. It said not just that we should logically interpret data and that data will drive our theories. It said those theories may not ever come to the conclusion that God was involved in any way. It can only be naturalistic explanations that we can come up with.
The idea of natural selection actually was kind of around in those days when Darwin was developing his theory. Other people, in fact, had proposed essentially the same thing, but nobody had developed it in detail and with lined up arguments and evidence and made a case for it. So Darwin collected these ideas, and he credits reading Malthus on population over population and the competition for resources, and he was thinking about nature as a kind of a competition between different organisms, and then he realized there's more organisms than there are resources, so naturally those who are stronger will get the resources and survive. And he played off that actually an inevitable conclusion. It's self-evident that if you have limited resources, the stronger are going to succeed better than the weaker. But Darwin's real strength, I think, was in developing a series of arguments that rested on evidence that, in fact, this kind of thing does happen in nature.
Well, I would say Darwin is certainly an icon in science. He's respected, and his contribution is perceived as really world-changing in some respects. So he is one of the holy saints of science, at the same level as Newton or other very important figure, Galileo Galilei. Now, when it comes to the mechanisms that Darwin suggested in terms of what could bring change in species or what could originate new species, when you begin to look at the granular level of the theory that he proposed, that might not be as popular nowadays. Why? Because we have so much more understanding of the complexity of life and understanding of basic things like the DNA, for example, that was not common knowledge at the time of Darwin. So he could envisage a much simpler way, in a sense, or a broad sketch of what he thought could happen, but he didn't have a clue of what was actually happening inside cells.
Today, Darwin's views are somewhat under scrutiny, but it would be helpful, I think, to kind of dissect apart his views. One of his views was naturalism, and that view is under challenge. There's evidence, maybe there's gaps in nature, that there must be some kind of power involved. And of course, the intelligent design movement has used that and developed that argument that in fact there is something more than just nature. Another view of Darwin is that natural selection can account for varieties that adapt to local habitats. And I think virtually everybody accepts that. Then Darwin's view that microevolution, if you want to call it that, this natural selection of small changes, that accumulates over time to eventually produce macroevolution. Well, scientists have held to that very strongly because they were afraid to give creationists any kind of a, of a foothold. But as time has gone on, the scientific community has kind of gotten wary of that argument, saying, no, we don't see this is going to work. For example, if it's advantageous to have a longer tail, well, you can get that tail longer and longer and longer, but you're never going to make a wing out of it. How do you get a new organ? Microevolution just is not going to add up to a new organ. Plus, looking at the fossil record, you do not see that in any way. Looking at modern experiments, you do not see that in any way. It just doesn't work. So at the present time, the scientific community, the evolutionary biology community, is looking for ways to explain macroevolution. So far, they haven't found one, but there's many, many, many of them that recognize that Darwin's theory doesn't cut it. Another aspect of Darwin's theory is common ancestry. And I think for the most part, common ancestry is still accepted without empirical evidence, I would say, but as a necessary conclusion from materialism. If you're going to have only natural processes, you're not going to have different kinds of animals popping into existence all over the place. You're lucky to have it once. And so if you have once, then maybe you can play with it from then on. But common ancestry is one I think is weakly supported, but it's necessary for naturalism.
The people who are molecular biologists and who are experts in the field of how genes act and how they function and whether or not genes get duplicated and what bacteria do with extra DNA if they encounter it, those guys are often working on particular problems. They're trying to solve cancer. They're trying to come up with a way of dealing with COVID. They're trying to solve a particular problem. And then you have another group of people over here who are trying to show that evolution is true. And they'll hypothesize about things that happen with DNA, these massive gene duplications that then resulted in new functions. But they never actually check their hypotheses with the people who actually know what they're talking about in terms of molecular biology. So there's often not a whole lot of crossover in between those fields, the theoretical evolutionary biologists and then the ones who actually are where the rubber meets the road. So I think sometimes hypotheses get generated about how these processes could have taken place. They're not necessarily in line with what even evolutionary molecular biologists would have to say. So there's sometimes a disconnect there. So that's the main way. They just ignore it often. The people who are working in problem-solving areas, evolution obviously took place. Have you thought about it? No, I'm busy trying to solve cancer. These guys down here, evolution obviously took place. Well, have you thought about it? Yes, I'm thinking about it very carefully. I think that this happened and this happened. Well, but that can't happen. Well, don't dissuade me with the facts, ma'am. So sometimes there's a lot of what are called in the literature just so stories, that this must have happened this way. Do we have any proof? Maybe, but there's no it happened in the laboratory.
Worldview are kind of like glasses. That's one of my favorite illustrations. But the glasses, everyone has a pair. Some people aren't as aware of their worldview as others, but basically it's the lenses through which we interpret life. Worldviews are really helpful in what we would use them to answer the big questions. Does God exist? Does he or doesn't he? However you answer that question determines a whole lot of direction of where you're going to go. Where did the world come from? What does it mean to be human? Is there life after death? Ethics. Why are some things right or wrong? And then maybe another question might be, is there a grand overarching story that gives meaning to existence or not?
I don't want to hear him. So, so what do you think? Wasn't it good what she said, Susie said, that there's two kinds of biologists, one's working on evolution, the other is working on cures and so forth, and they don't check each other's, anyway, I just thought it was great. So, anyway, let's take a look at a couple things from the Bible as we conclude this subject. By faith, we understand the universe was formed at God's command so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. What is that? That's the opposite of materialism. Material says that material is all there is. And we say, no, there's more than that. There's things we can't see. And those things that we can't see have a lot to do with us being here. Now, what's interesting to this is that if you have a humerus bone in your body, like I'm afraid I was born with, I'd like to point out to evolutionists sometimes, oh, you guys, have you heard of dark matter, dark energy, dark matter? Dark energy and dark matter have to make the Big Bang work. So you got dark matter. They've never seen dark matter. They've never seen or found any way of sensing dark energy. They have no way of knowing it's there, but it's got to be there. So I say, hey, look, we both believe in things that you can't see. So how about that? That's pretty cool. Anyway, they don't all have good senses of humor. So I'm going to conclude with a Bible story that had to do with Paul in the city of Athens, talking to what we could consider as proto-scientists or early forms of science, okay? Let's take a look and see what happened. Now, the Apostle Paul, while he was waiting for his companions in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, what does this babbler want to say? Epicurean, Stoic philosophers. Epicurean is after Epicurus, and this is what they believe. The gods are not involved in the world. They're too busy having fun. Mankind should don't worry about it, be happy, and there is no afterlife. Now, over against them were Stoics, and Stoics followed Zeno, and they believe that God is in nature, not above it. Man's happiness comes from overcoming wrong attitudes through increased knowledge. So these were the book readers. You got happiness, fulfillment by just getting smarter. But there is no afterlife. You see, the one area they agree, no afterlife. So, talking about Paul, others said he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods because he preached to them Jesus and the what? The resurrection. That's a challenge to their worldview. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, that's that hillside there in the lower right, may we now know what this new doctrine is of which you speak. So Paul addresses them, and Paul is no slouch intellectually. He was equivalent of a PhD in his day. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious, for as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. In other words, he picks up very cleverly, I think, on this one point. So you're admitting you don't know everything about what's up there. So let's expand on that a little bit. Let me offer you some possible view. And he goes and talks about that God that they may have been worshiping unknowing. God who made the world and everything in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. I could just see Paul pointing at buildings around him. Nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. In other words, if he really is a God, he's well above where we are. We ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. Truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. And he's given assurance of this by what? To all by raising him from the dead. Okay, now at that point, when they heard of the resurrection, some mocked, but, this was what they were struggling with. A being that made heaven and earth, a creator who gives and actively maintains the life of all creatures, he sustains, someone who can't be contained in temples or properly represented by man's reason or art, A divinity above natural laws and fully capable of suspending them at will, like raising someone from the dead. A God to whom we are responsible. There's a judgment coming. All these things were a challenge. But interestingly, it says some believed. And all of a sudden, they had a paradigm shift, and the focus came in, and they could see things differently. Paradigm shift. I talked to a secular person on the subject of paradigm shift. I said, oh, you know, in the church, we know what a paradigm shift is. We call that a conversion. That's what a paradigm shift is. You see things differently. Alistair McGrath, I don't know if you've ever heard of Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist. I had an earlier quote from him. This is his fellow professor at Oxford, who's a Christian. Take a look. Although I was passionately and totally persuaded of the truth and relevance of atheism as a young man, I subsequently found myself persuaded that Christianity was a much more interesting and intellectually exciting worldview than atheism. Interesting. So paradigm shifts still happen. And I'm going to conclude with this person. Who is Werner von Braun? Rocket guy? Yes, the original rocket, scientist, right? Right. He was the head of NASA's science program. If there's one person on planet Earth that was responsible for putting somebody on the moon, walking on the moon, it was Werner von Braun. And notice, religion and science are sisters. The one seeks knowledge of creation and the other of the creator. He was a creationist in his belief. And could he still do good science? Wow. Ask Neil Armstrong. So anyway, the point is science and religion are in battle with each other. There's no question about popular science. But if you can separate out hard science from philosophical science that has a worldview that is naturalistic in its view, a naturalistic methodological worldview, then that makes sense. So do you have any questions on the things we've talked about tonight? Or did I explain things so well that you have absolutely no questions and you're ready to hit the sack? Anyway, any questions at all? So did I make a case? So you saw the history and how things changed. Secular humanism took over Western society, Western civilization. Always starts in the universities, including the religion departments. Charles Darwin had a degree in theology and religion. He was trained to be a minister, believe it or not, country parson. Because in those days, country parsons also could study other things. But anyway, science and so on. So he was taught by professors at Cambridge, and only one of them believed in Genesis as being historical. Only one out of all of the professors he had. So I don't blame Darwin's views entirely on himself. I have a problem with the theology department at Cambridge. So anyway, so any other thoughts, questions? So what we're going to do tomorrow, shall I lay that out? So it's at 9:30. Is that the 9:15? 9:15. Oh, you're getting me up early. So 9:15 we're going to start here with, which one is it again? The oceans. We're going to talk about the flood. And the flood is remarkably proven by both geology and history. So we'll talk about that. Oh, look what, I can find out what I'm doing. And of course, for Sabbath morning worship, I have a talk based on what we're talking about is actually being prophesied, predicted in the book of Revelation. The subject is predicted in Revelation. Then in the afternoon, I've got two, and that is dinosaurs. And I'll give a little bit of an Adventist take on dinosaurs and origin of the earth. And that has to do with, and I'm very frank with where we have problems. All views have unanswered questions. So what? I remember distinctly, you saw Jim Gibson, the second scientist, speaking there. And Jim told me once, he said, Stan, I'm a scientist. I've learned to live with unanswered questions. But I like our questions better than theirs. So there you go, right? But we do have some questions about decay and about age of the earth. And I will do my best to deal with those very directly and very frankly. So we're going to see you tomorrow. Pastor, you want to come up? What are you up to?
Well, Well, you have brought some things of interest this weekend, and people's hopes have been raised. What do we have here?
This is
We'll do one tonight.
genuine swimming dinosaur's tooth from Morocco. It is an original. This animal was an eyewitness to the flood. But anyway,
You want to draw a name so you can get in trouble and not me?
am I going to do that? Ooh, let's see. I'm willing to take a bribe if you want to. Okay, you weren't fast enough. Okay.
What do we have there? Miley Thorkelson. Yay!
There you go.
Awesome. There you
All
go.
right. There you go.
Awesome. Thanks for coming out. We'll have a few more of those tomorrow.
We
Our
will.
morning programs is part of our Sabbath school and part of our worship service. And everyone is welcome to join us for lunch. So you don't have to come to 2 o'clock starving hungry. That would help, I think. All right. Thanks for coming out tonight, and we'll see you tomorrow.
God bless.